Hi, y'all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. We are finally able to turn to a case with more twists than a Grisham novel. It is wildly controversial. For some time now, I have been saying that this is going to be a case everybody's going to be talking about. It's going to be a case that offers so much controversy, so many questions that people just are not going to be able to stop talking about it. And it is. It's the Karen Reed case. As you know, we have been between the death of my husband. I was out for a few weeks, and then there was also the fact that we were knee deep in the Daybell case, in the Chad Daybell case. That verdict and the death penalty came down this weekend. I've got several videos on that, so be sure to check those out if you haven't seen them yet. But now we can turn to the Karen Reed case. But that leaves us with something we need to do. We need to catch up. And for those of you who have been following along, here is your comprehensive A to Z statement of everything that's happening in the Karen Reed case, what's happened so far, so that you can be sure you haven't missed anything important. We are going to cover all of the witnesses. It's going to be a summary. We're only going to do the highlights. This is part one. I expect there to be at least one more part, possibly two, but I think we'll finish tomorrow night. We're going to go at 7 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to do it as quickly as possible while still covering all the key points to make sure you don't miss anything. So for a quick background, here's what the case is about. John O'Keefe was found dead in the snow outside the home of a Boston police officer named Brian Albert. Now, prosecutors say he was the victim of a hit and run by his girlfriend, Karen Reed. Karen and John had been out drinking with a group, and they headed over to the home of Brian and his wife, Nicole Albert, for an after party. So the relationship between Karen and John, Karen Reed being the defendant, John O'Keefe being the man who died in the snow outside the home, that relationship, the prosecutors say, was falling apart. She had made allegations that he was cheating. And the night of January 28th to the early morning of January 29th, they say that Karen Reed was heavily intoxicated. She dropped him off at the home of Brian and Nicole Albert for an after party. They'd been out drinking with a group. They had met up with the Alberts and friends of theirs, family of theirs. And then there was going to be an after party at Brian's and Nicole's. Everybody invited on over. So they headed over there. But Karen decided not to go in. John did go in. He got out of the car. And according to the prosecutors, as he got out of the car, Karen intentionally backed over him and left him for dead. Now, the prosecution says she admitted that. She admitted it to many people, and they found telltale pieces of her shattered taillight at the scene of the crime. Now, they arrested Karen Reed and charged her with second-degree murder, manslaughter while operating under the influence of alcohol, and leaving the scene of personal injury or death. Not surprisingly, the defense has a starkly different view of the case. They say Karen Reed has been framed. John O'Keefe was beaten inside the house of Brian and Nicole Albert. He was dragged out into the snow and he was left for dead. They believe his appearance doesn't match being hit with a car. They think and there are scratches on his arm, they say came from the Alberts' dog, who coincidentally was later rehomed by the Alberts. They believe that local detectives, especially including lead state police detective Michael Proctor, who had deep ties with the Alberts, helped the Alberts with a cover-up. Law enforcement did no real investigation of the Alberts, and they set Karen Reed up to take the fall to protect their own. They even sprinkled broken pieces of taillight around the scene. Proctor later wrote that, this is the lead investigator, that he hoped Karen Reed killed herself and searched her phone, and separately, and he searched her phone for nude photographs of her. So as we get into this, I'm going to start with what's happened at the trial so far. If you would hit the like button, that will really help with the video. And if you will subscribe, we would really like to see you back for more. Let me say hi and do a shout out to the first 5 who were in the chat tonight. Marlon, Loves My Angel, Beth A., Sable 1, and Debbie Harper. Welcome. A special welcome to all of you, and a special welcome to those first 5. So the prosecutor started with a very traditional move that lawyers often do: try to humanize the victim of the crime. In this case, the person who died, by putting on people who know that person. It may have been a mistaken choice here, given how controversial it is about whether or not Karen Read actually committed this crime. It certainly ended up being sort of a slow start for the prosecution. The first witness was John O'Keefe's brother, Paul O'Keefe, who talked about the fact that John had taken in their niece and nephew when their sister and her husband died. So they were orphans, and John took them in. He also knew that John and Karen had fought over Karen spending too much on gifts for the children and over what she chose to feed the children. Now, John's wife, Karen, had been friends with Karen and said that after O'Keefe's body was found, she was the second witness, Karen made a couple of strange comments. One was that she had to remember the bad times, and the other was, I don't think I'm ever going to see you guys again. So then the prosecution moved into the actual case. We're going to divide this into a couple of parts we're going to cover tonight, and a third part we're going to cover next on our next video tomorrow night. So the prosecution went into the actual case, and they started by talking to the paramedics and the officers who showed up at the scene that snowy Boston day. And witness number 3 was Officer Steve Seraph. He had 2 critical pieces of testimony. First, there were footprints around the body, but none coming from the house. That would suggest that the prosecution is right, that John O'Keefe wasn't placed in the snow down by the road by people in the house, else there would have been footprints. Secondly, the Officer Seraph said that Karen Read confessed at the scene, that she said, "This is all my fault. This is all my fault. I did this." You are going to hear as we go through the testimony that the witnesses are all over the place on what Karen Read said. There are some who say she confessed, many who say she did not. The defense pointed out on cross-examination that Officer Seraph testified to the grand jury in April 2022, and he never mentioned that Karen Read had supposedly confessed at the scene. The defense also was able to show that the police dispatch log had numerous mistakes, like it didn't get the time and order that the officers arrived at the scene right, like it didn't have the correct address of the house. It had numerous different addresses of the house where John O'Keefe was found. The next witness was Canton police officer Stephen Mullaney. He testified to a rather unorthodox method of dealing with a scene. He used a leaf blower, the group of them did, to clear the snow and to search for evidence around John O'Keefe. But as the defense pointed out on cross, Officer Mullaney never did see any pieces of broken taillight. That supports the defense theory that those pieces of taillight were planted at the scene after the fact. They were not there when John O'Keefe's body was first found. Canton firefighter and paramedic Timothy Nuttall came next. He testified that Karen told him, "I hit him. I hit him." Now, on cross, the defense pointed out that Nuttall had told lead investigator Michael Proctor, that Read made those statements to somebody else. And now he was claiming that Read had made the statements to them directly. Now, that doesn't directly impeach what he said. Either way, he had said he heard the words, "I hit him." But it does suggest that maybe something is wrong about the testimony. Canton firefighter Anthony Flamati testified next and said that when they got there to the scene, John O'Keefe was found lying on his back about 10 feet away from the road in the Albert's yard. O'Keefe was in extreme hypothermia with a core body temp of only 80 degrees. He said that in a brief, less than 1 minute conversation, Karen Read told him, "I hit him. I hit him. Oh my God, I hit him." The defense played video from the scene, though, and it didn't show Flamati ever talking to Karen Read. The prosecution suggested, well, maybe that conversation happened before the body cam picked up. Canton firefighter and paramedic Matthew Kelly testified next. He said that when they got to O'Keefe, his body was cold, was stiff. He had no pulse. He wasn't breathing. Blood or vomit, bile, something was coming out of his mouth. Now, Kelly said he had never heard Karen Reed say, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. He did hear her say, he's dead, he's effing dead. Canton firefighter Frances Walsh testified that there were two women at the scene who were quite worked up, and one of them screamed, is he alive? Based on everything else, that would most likely have been Karen Reed. So again, this is someone screaming something different this time. As I said, it's all over the place what they said. In fact, I think for one of our next videos, I'm going to do a chart for us of all the things, all the different things that they said. So keep tuned for that. We'll get to that. Canton firefighter Katie McLaughlin was one of the most interesting witnesses, I thought. She said that Karen Reed repeatedly said, I hit him. So that fit with the prosecution's story. It was so striking, she said, that she called over a sergeant to hear what was being said because Karen Reed was saying, I hit him. And she thought, somebody in law enforcement needs to know about this. She was a firefighter dealing with the medical side. On cross-examination, the defense pointed out that the report by investigator Michael Proctor says that McLaughlin said Karen Reed made that statement to her friend, not directly to McLaughlin. Now, Karen Reed's team also went after Katie McLaughlin as being biased. She went to school with Caitlin Albert, who is, coincidentally, the daughter of Brian Albert, the man who owned the house where John O'Keefe's body was found outside in the snow. McLaughlin said she wasn't really all that close to Caitlin Albert and downplayed their relationship. The defense wanted to show the jury a couple of photos they had of Caitlin Albert and Katie McLaughlin together. But the court, including a bathing suit picture of the two of them taken together. But the court said no, did not allow those pictures and evidence. But since that time, the defense informed the court that they have received a deluge of pictures from people watching the trial that show the two of them together, the two women together. They believe that McLaughlin perjured herself when she said she wasn't close to Caitlin Albert. So do not be surprised to see that issue resurface. Now, Canton Fire Lieutenant Greg Woodbury weighed in, saying that what he heard Reed say was, is he dead? Is he dead? So they are all over the place on what exactly she said. And of course, it's entirely possible she said every one of those things. Just because one person heard a statement doesn't mean other people didn't actually hear a different statement. Canton firefighter and paramedic Daniel Whitley said that Karen Reed told him she didn't want to live anymore if her husband died. Now, they weren't technically married, but they have been together for a time, Karen and John O'Keefe. Karen said that if O'Keefe was alive, she wanted to know, is O'Keefe alive or is he dead? And she asked whether someone could be alive in the snow without a jacket for many hours. That's going to be important because of a search we're going to hear about later done by one of the witnesses. We'll get to that. Now, according to this witness, Daniel Whitley, Karen Reed was crying about the fact that maybe now she would have to take care of the kids, the niece and nephew who lived with John O'Keefe. And she was saying she couldn't do it. She didn't feel able to do it. Canton firefighter and paramedic Jason Becker was up next. He testified that Karen Reed was concerned about who was going to take care of the niece and nephew. And he agreed. She also was saying she didn't think she could take care of them on her own. Karen Reed also said that she had gotten into an argument with John O'Keefe. And she was sad because that was the very last thing that she'd said to him was this argument that they had. According to this particular witness, Jason Becker, Karen Reed said, could he be dead? Could he be dead? And she said, could I have hit him? Paul Gallagher, a lieutenant with the Canton Police Department, was up next. He talked about light pink spots in the snow that might be blood. Remember how they used a leaf blower to melt that snow? They used that to get down to the blood stains. that where they also found, he said, broken pieces of a cocktail glass. They believed that was a glass John O'Keefe carried from the bar with him. They used a rather unorthodox method of collecting some of the evidence from the scene. They used red Solo cups to collect 6 frozen blood samples. The attorney for Karen Reed, they have more than one. She has more than one attorney. This particular attorney, Jackson, asked, "Do you think it's standard procedure for police departments to borrow red Solo cups from a neighbor to collect evidence?" And the prosecution objected, but the judge allowed the answer. And then the witness said, "Well, of course not. Nothing about the scene was standard," which wasn't exactly in favor of something that they would be able to use. The defense pointed out some glaring problems with the investigation. Gallagher did not search the Albert home, for example. So outside in the snow, a person has died, and at no point did law enforcement search the home where the body was found right in front of that. Didn't search it, didn't try to get a warrant. And Gallagher's explanation was the reason was he didn't think he had probable cause. He didn't even apply for the warrant because of that. He insisted that he did not avoid investigating just because this was the home of a Boston police officer. Gallagher also interviewed one of probably the most important witness of the entire case, Jennifer McCabe. And he did it without recording it or even taking notes. Critical witness, no effort to memorialize what she said. So we then moved to Canton Police Sergeant Sean Good, who talked about all the calls that had come in. He was working back at the department that night and all the calls that were coming in. He went to the scene and he reported that Karen Reed was running around yelling, "Is he dead?" He did not hear Reed say, "I hit him," and he did not see any pieces of the broken taillight during that initial search. There, and we have one more. Canton one more under the officers and the people who showed up at the scene for law enforcement or paramedics and so forth. Canton officer Michael Lank. He came to the scene to investigate. He was with the Canton police. Ultimately, it was decided that the Canton police were conflicted out because of the fact that Brian Albert's brother worked for them. So the defense believes Lank has a deep relationship with the Alberts. They point to the fact that back in 2002, a man got into a fight with Chris Albert, and Lank fought that same guy a little later that same day. The suggestion by the defense is he jumped in to help Chris Albert, but the details are a little fuzzy. Lank talked to the Alberts for about 15 to 20 minutes in their home. He didn't record the interview. He took no notes, and he said he didn't search the home because, just as the previous witness, he said he didn't believe he had probable cause. So then on February 4, 2022, 6 days after O'Keefe died, Lank got a call asking him to return to Fairview Road. That's where the Alberts lived, because the Chief Ken Berkowitz, had possibly discovered more evidence at the scene. This time, Lank found red pieces of that taillight near where O'Keefe's body had been found. Now, prosecutors believe those red pieces were part of Karen Reed's taillight. The defense thinks this is absurd. There were plenty of investigators there earlier. They didn't find these pieces of the red taillight. How days later does someone driving by happen to spot them? That makes no sense. They think law enforcement intentionally placed those pieces of taillight at the scene. The reason they did it was to frame Karen Reed. I need to say a couple of thank yous from Pam. And I understand what Pam is saying, and thank you so much for the super chat. She's saying that it's hard to imagine a cover-up would include so many people: state police, fire department, forensic investigators. That's a lot of people. And That is definitely the case. One of the things that is always harder for lawyers is if there are too many people involved in a conspiracy, it's really hard to prove that all of them were involved. So that's exactly, but the defense says they believe they have evidence and they're going to be putting that out. But it is definitely a big challenge here. This isn't just one person, but a group of people that Karen Reed believes framed her. And I'm so glad that Mia Marone has been a member for a month. I'm so glad. All right, let's dive into, now we're going to turn to the next category of witnesses. We started off with the direct family, paramedics, firefighters, etc. And now we're going on to the family witnesses. We're not going to finish these today. These were the people who were drinking with Karen Reed and with John O'Keefe earlier in the evening, and who were at that after party. Some of them were, some of them weren't, but we're going to talk, I'll explain for each of these. There are a number of these people. It was a pretty large group. So Chris Albert is you've just heard about him, but Chris Albert is the brother of the homeowner, Brian Albert. And Chris lived near, it may have even been next door to John O'Keefe. The defense says that Chris's son, Colin, had a long-standing feud with John O'Keefe. The defense believes that Colin, who is roughly 18 at this time, may have been involved with O'Keefe's death. Now, Chris admits that his son Colin was at Brian Albert's house that night, the very evening when John O'Keefe was hurt and ended up in the snow. The defense wanted to know whether he neglected to mention that Colin was at the house when state police interviewed him in February 2022. He said he didn't remember, he wasn't really sure, but he insists that his son Colin never gave O'Keefe the finger, which was one of the allegations, never told him F you. They weren't having a feud. Now, Chris was with that group at the Waterfall Bar earlier in the evening and testified that he didn't go to the after party at his brother's house. Instead, he went on home. He claimed he got home between 12:05 and 12:10, and that his son Colin arrived 10 or 15 minutes later. This is important because the prosecution is trying to push the time that Colin left to before O'Keefe even arrived. If that's the case, then he obviously couldn't have had anything to do with harming O'Keefe. But the defense pointed out that the Waterfall Bar video shows that Chris Albert didn't even leave the Waterfall until 12 to 12:13. So he couldn't have gotten home between 12:05 and 12:10. He hadn't even left yet. And then Colin arrived home 10 to 15 minutes after that. So it pushes the time that Colin got home even later. Now, Julie Albert is Chris Albert's wife. She testified next. Her son had been at the Albert home, she admitted, on the night of January 8th. And the reason he was there was the owners of the home who had a son, also Brian Albert, but Jr., who was celebrating a birthday the next day. And so Colin went over just to say happy birthday to his cousin. And she said that Colin got home at about 12:30 a.m. So there could have been some overlap, but not a lot, probably, because everybody agrees that people left the Waterfall Bar at roughly midnight when it closed. So next we go to Nicole Albert. She is one of the homeowners. Nicole and Brian Albert own the home. Her son, Brian Jr., was turning 23 that next day, January 29th. By now it was January 29th, just barely. And she also was at the Waterfall Bar that evening. She said she didn't observe any kind of tension between John O'Keefe and Karen Reed. They weren't fighting. She said she didn't see any signs of intoxication. And that was true for pretty much every witness. No one said they thought Karen Reed seemed really intoxicated. No one said that she and John O'Keefe were fighting at the bar. But on the other hand, this witness did say, well, she didn't see that, but she wasn't really interacting with them all of that much. So she might not have seen it. Now, interestingly, although John O'Keefe and Karen Reed may not have been fighting, according to this witness and video that the prosecutor showed, Brian Albert and his friend Brian Higgins started play fighting, which is just really strange for adults. She said that her husband often does practice fighting or goes into fighting stances when he drinks. He has fighting experience, she said, from being in the Marine Corps. It was a little bit strange, but when she got home from the waterfall bar, she said that her nephew Colin was still at the house. As you know, as I said a minute ago, he was there to wish his cousin Brian a happy birthday. And Colin said, somebody's picking me up, and he left after a couple of minutes, maybe not even that long, she said. So the prosecutor is trying to show and to get Colin out of the house before he could have done anything, even conceivably, in a fight with John O'Keefe. Nicole said she didn't mention to law enforcement that Colin had been at the house because Colin was leaving when she got there, and she just didn't associate him with the entire event. Now, all of the people who came over after this left her home by about 2, she said. And she was sure that O'Keefe never came in her house. Everyone who was inside the house said that same thing. Now, butt dials have been a huge issue in this particular case. Here is just one of many. I may even do a whole video on this, but here's one example. The phone records show that someone using Nicole's phone had a 9-second call with her sister, Jennifer McCabe, at 6:07 a.m. That was the morning that John O'Keefe was discovered. And to be clear, Jennifer was probably right outside the home at that time, probably trying to alert her sister to all this that was going on outside. But Nicole said she never answered a phone call from Jennifer that morning. And so it was one of the many, and like I say, I may do a whole video on this, but the many strange things around phone calls, butt dials, etc. Now, a couple of other points. Well, she did say that she had to admit that neither she nor Brian went out on the lawn to check on or to help John O'Keefe, even once they realized he was out there and had been discovered on their lawn. Now, a couple of other points. The Alberts sold their home and got rid of their dog. Nicole said those decisions had absolutely nothing to do with John O'Keefe's death. She said that a neighbor had sold a home for a really good price, and they just decided to go ahead and sell. She said they rehomed their dog to Vermont in the months after O'Keefe died, but that didn't have anything to do with the case or with O'Keefe having been attacked. She did say that Chloe, the dog, had attacked other dogs, and there was an incident where Chloe was fighting with another dog, and the owner of the other dog ended up getting injured. And so now we get to Brian Albert. He's the owner of the home, along with Nicole, now retired from the Boston Police Department. His brother, Kevin Albert, so we've got Chris, Brian, and Kevin. His brother, Kevin Albert, is a Canton police detective. Now, Brian had gone with Brian Higgins, I'm definitely going to have to do us a chart with some names and all the people in it, but Brian Higgins is an ATF agent. And they had gone with another officer to a funeral in New York City for a police officer who had died in the line of duty. And then they met out at some bars. Everybody, he said, was in a good mood at the waterfall. He talked about that bizarre play fighting thing with with Brian Higgins, the ATF agent. And this was the question that went back and forth. At some point, did you flip him around, grab him in a wrestling hold? That from the defense lawyer. And Albert said, well, he may have. He couldn't recall whether he had done that or not. So they went back to the house, to Brian Albert's and Nicole Albert's house. But John O'Keefe and Karen Reed never came in. He said that for sure. Now, Colin was there when Brian got home. But Brian agreed with everybody else that Colin left quickly, no more than 5 minutes afterwards, and that Brian and Nicole didn't bother to mention Colin to Michael Proctor, that investigator, because Colin wasn't there for the duration. They didn't think it was important to mention him. Now, Brian Albert says he took Brian Higgins. We got 2 Brians going, but Brian Higgins is the ATF agent. Brian Albert is the owner of the home, and he's Boston Police Department. He says he took Brian Higgins upstairs for 2 to 3 minutes to show him some military photos. That becomes important because Brian Higgins says He didn't go up or downstairs. And we're going to hear much more about the whole upstairs, downstairs, sort of shades of Chad Daybell in that regard. Now, Brian Albert says he woke up when Jennifer McCabe burst into the room that morning. She was hysterical. She was telling them that John O'Keefe was dead in their yard. So Brian went downstairs where he found Canton Police Sergeant Michael Lank waiting to talk to him. Albert said he'd met Lank before multiple times. They hadn't really socialized, but they knew each other. Now, as I said, there were a lot of strange facts around the large number of butt dials, as they call them, the deleted messages, and the destroyed phones. And here's another example. Phone records showed that Higgins, Brian Higgins, one of the Bryans, and Brian Albert spoke briefly after 2 a.m., which was after Higgins left the house. Why were they talking? The defense wants to know. The first call was just for a second or two. The second call, Higgins called back 17 seconds later, and that second call lasted for 22 seconds. But bizarrely, both Brian Albert and Brian Higgins deny calling each other. Brian Albert says, in fact, that he was in bed with his wife, with his phone in the bed with him, and having an intimate moment with his wife, which gives a whole new meaning to the phrase butt dial. It does leave you to wonder what on earth Higgins thought during that 17 seconds. But Higgins says he never answered this call. We're going to get to all of that tomorrow. Brian Albert claims that no one from the prosecutor's office told him in September 2022 to preserve his phone. The prosecutors wrote him, as it turns out, but he says he never got that letter. So, under no duty to preserve it, he got rid of his phone on September 22nd, 2022, which turned out to be just hours before he was ordered by a court to preserve it. And that's his testimony, that he destroyed the phone literally hours before he was going to be required to preserve it, to save it, so that law enforcement could look through it. That is coincidentally exactly what Brian Higgins did with his phone. And you can imagine what the defense thinks about this. You can easily imagine. So now let's get to Brian Albert Jr. And I'm going to go through some of the witnesses who were there. Brian Albert Jr., he's the one who was having the birthday on the 29th. He testified to pretty much the same facts that his parents did. He said that Colin Albert got there at 10:45 or 11 p.m. range. He was preparing to leave just as Brian, Nicole, and their daughter, his sister Caitlin, all walked in. He said that Jennifer and Matt McCabe were the last to arrive and no one came in after that. He said he saw a truck outside. That truck would likely be Brian Higgins' truck, which had a snowplow on the front. And a little in front of it, he saw a dark SUV. That would be the dark SUV Karen Reed was driving, and John O'Keefe was with her. He said that, and all of the witnesses, most of the witnesses anyway, said that SUV pulled up at some point and then pulled up a little further. So here's the house. Let's say we're facing the house. This is the house. Here's the flagpole over here. The car moved from here to here to here. It kept moving closer to the flagpole further down. He said he saw tire tracks in the snow, but never saw a man lying in the snow. Now, Caitlin Albert, the sister, the daughter of the homeowners, who no longer lived at the house, said when she arrived, Colin was in the foyer and he was headed home. She was inside when Brian Higgins then arrived. Now, that contradicts a little bit what Brian said, which was that he got there before the homeowners did. But Brian, I suppose, could have stayed in his car for a while first. Now, the McCabes arrived after all of this, and everyone says, all of the witnesses say, it was after Colin left. O'Keefe and Reed never came in the house, according to what Caitlin said. Caitlin said that her father showed Brian Higgins some photos in the family room area. Those photos, remember the steps, that's all important. She says she was the very last visitor to leave, and they drove in the direction of that flagpole. There was a hard snow. Her boyfriend was driving. She was talking to him. She wasn't looking. She didn't notice a body. One of the arguments the defense makes is If there was a body out there, how do all of these people drive by and nobody notices the body? But and we'll get to one person who might have. We'll talk about that. Julie Nagel was a friend of Brian Albert Jr.'s. She had been there to help Brian Albert Jr. celebrate his birthday. And she agreed. Reed and O'Keefe never came into the house. This is important because she's not a direct family member, but obviously is a family friend. She also, like others, noticed that black SUV sitting outside the home, and she noticed it in 3 different spots at various times. The McCabe's gave her a ride home at 1:45 a.m., she said, and she is the one witness who says she saw a black blob in the ground by the flagpole that was several feet long. She voiced something, I think I might have seen something, said something, called out to the people in the group, but she said she was intoxicated. Nobody commented back. She didn't push it. She wasn't really sure what she had seen. So Terry Kuhn, a veterinary forensic specialist, talked about the swabs from John O'Keefe's shirt. One of the reasons this was important, remember I told you that John O'Keefe, well, I don't even know if we talked about it too much tonight, but John O'Keefe had multiple injuries. He looked like he had been beaten up. Now, that may be due to the fact that he had a severe head injury and his skull had been cracked along multiple fracture lines. And that could have caused things like the swollen black eyes and so forth. But what he also had 4 scratches along his arm. The defense believes that is from the dog Chloe, and that Chloe attacked him inside the house. She was part of this fight, and then he was killed or near dead, and they put him outside in the yard to wait for him to die in the cold. This witness said, well, the swabs were negative for canine DNA, so it wasn't dog DNA. But she did find, bizarrely, pig DNA. She said, well, that could have been from food like bacon, for example. Leading to this great cross-examination, you're not aware of any feral pig populations in Massachusetts, are you? And the witness said, I'm not. The little crossover there with our Alec Murdoch case. You remember the feral pig issues in that one. So we are nearly finished with our witnesses for the evening. And then I'm going to take some questions and we'll save the rest for tomorrow night. A few more people that I do want to thank. Janet, thank you for the super sticker. I appreciate that. And Criminal Med, what's my take on Proctor? Do you think the jury will view not putting the lead detective on for the prosecution? I think that looks funny. I would say not putting the lead detective on looks funny. I don't see how you can get around that. And Jen Ken, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate all of you and your questions and your super chats. So Ryan Nagel, Julie's brother, and 2 of his friends came by to pick Julie up. They let a black SUV turn onto Fairview before they did. That would be Karen Reed and John O'Keefe in the black SUV. They parked behind the SUV. They saw the brake lights come on. The SUV moved further away. There were a couple of important points about this. One, that he didn't observe any damage to the taillights. Of course, the prosecution thinks the taillight got damaged when she ran backwards into her boyfriend and knocked him over and ultimately killed him. He also said he didn't see anybody get out of the vehicle and go in the house. Now, next, Heather Maxim was with Ryan Nagel. She agreed that they parked behind this dark SUV. She said she didn't see any damage to the back of the SUV. She agreed with him on that. She didn't see anybody get out of it. But one other thing, several of these witnesses, something really odd. Here's a full-size Jeep Wrangler with a snowplow on the front, and she didn't even notice this as being between her car and the SUV. That would be Brian Higgins' car. Brian Higgins was there, so why would they not have seen his car? Had he gone by this time? We don't really know, but certainly the defense thinks there's a problem here. And then Richard D'Antonio was a friend of Ryan Nagel's. D'Antuono, I'm going with that. A friend of Ryan Nagel's, and he was the one driving. So he said he noticed that SUV parked in front of him, but and he didn't observe any damage to it. But again, he didn't see that Jeep with the snowplow. So by the time they arrived, there may not have been a Jeep there. Brian Higgins may have already left. Allie McCabe is the daughter of Jennifer McCabe, and this is where we're going to stop after this one. And Colin, her brother, remember Colin Albert, texted her and asked for a ride. He said he needed a ride because he'd been drinking. She pulled in. She did not see her parents, Jennifer and Matt McCabe's vehicle. So that would be important because it sort of pinpoints the time when Colin left the party, and that would be before John O'Keefe and Karen Reed arrived. At least that's what the prosecution is pushing for. So Colin, she said he didn't have any injuries. He didn't appear intoxicated. She got home at 12:30 a.m. So that is where we're going to stop and take a few questions. And let me, thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. Okay, let's head over to the questions over here. I'm going to move back a little bit because I mentioned them early, and but now is a good time. If you would also be sure to put question marks at the beginning, I would really appreciate that. It makes it a lot easier to spot. So I'm much more likely to spot your question because I'm trying to scroll quickly down through the chat, and sometimes I miss some. We've only, and let me sort of give like an overview. Right now, we've covered about half of the trial that's happened so far. It's been multiple days. I don't even know how many hours of testimony, but many, many hours of testimony. So I'm trying to distill it down to a couple of hours so we can catch up quickly and move on to all of the new things that occur. And also because it's really useful, I think, to get an overview of the case. So you can kind of see, where is the prosecution heading? Where is the defense heading? What are the best arguments? If you see it, if you step back and look at it as a whole, it makes it a lot easier to evaluate what they're saying and what you're hearing. Okay, so Atticus is asking, do I know who is caring for John O'Keefe's niece and nephew? And I don't know who is caring for them. I would imagine that it would be family members, but I don't know what the answer to that is. Let's see, I'm looking for the question marks. Here we go. Todd Moore wants to know says that it seems weird that hitting a body could break a taillight. Like a wall, yes, but not something that can move or bounce off a car. And we have not seen, at least I haven't seen all of the testimony from today, but we have not seen any reconstruction that I've seen that would show how the head got so injured or exactly how things occurred. How did the car hit the body? How did he end up 10 feet off the road, as one of the paramedics testified? How did all of that happen? We don't know. We do know that we've been told that Karen Reed supposedly backed 60 feet going 25 miles an hour into her boyfriend, John O'Keefe. That's tough. That's some skilled driving there to go 25 miles an hour, I think, anyway, 25 miles an hour, 60 feet backwards. So, but we haven't really seen that yet. They haven't done a lot with that yet. So we will hopefully find out more about that. Does the incompetent, poor investigation mean that Karen Reed may get off, and will her being overcharged increase that possibility? Annie K asks. And the answer is yes. Overcharging somebody increases the risk that they will get off of something that they've done, because the jury, once they don't believe people, once they don't trust the prosecution with what's been charged, it makes it more difficult to trust them overall. So definitely overcharging carries some risk for the prosecution. And I think here in this particular case, one of the things they charged is that there was intention behind it. There was actual intentional act by Karen Reed to kill her boyfriend. That's a very high standard. And are they going to be able to meet that is one of the questions. And does the incompetent, poor investigation mean that Karen Reed may get off? Always that's a problem, because again, it undermines the credibility. And if the jury stops believing in the credibility of the witnesses, I used to have a mentor who would always say, credibility is everything. Credibility is everything. And that's true with the jury. It's true with the judge. So if the jury comes to believe that there was a poor investigation, it definitely could hurt the prosecution. Now, in many cases, the defense makes some inroads and proves there are some issues with the prosecution, but the issues with the prosecution may not be big enough that it changes their minds. Okay, looking for the questions. Jersey Jen, what are your thoughts on the judge? And as from what I've seen, I feel like the judge has been patient and done a pretty good job. At the beginning, I felt like the judge was sort of more biased toward the prosecution. It's harder to tell that now, maybe because so many of the discussions are done in sidebar. But thus far, I'm not feeling that as we move into trial. So Hedgehog wants to know, have you ever been this confused 6 weeks into a trial? And I think what Hedgehog means is there definitely seem to be facts on both sides of the case. And that's part of the reason why it's been so controversial. So the prosecution will bring something out and you think, that's a good point. And the defense will just skewer the witness and you think, well, I don't know. So I think it's definitely one of the cases where I can see facts on both sides being brought out and that are being put together as a case. The defense has done a phenomenal job with cross-examination. Absolutely phenomenal. Mia Barone wants to know, do you think it's possible that those straight, linear, deep scratches could have been caused by a broken beer bottle? I don't see how they could, because that's going to be jagged. So how do you get linear? And they were a certain space apart from each other. I don't see how that could be a broken beer bottle, personally. But I have not figured out what it would be. And I think a side needs to come up with a theory on that. We need to be given some theory on what caused that. And the prosecution can't just let it go, I don't think, because then the defense is free to say it was a dog. Why it doesn't have canine DNA, I'm not sure. So Criminal Med wants to know, will they deem Proctor as a hostile witness? Hostile to, I'm not sure what you mean. I'm not sure to whom he would be hostile. So I don't know how to answer your question. So I'm not sure what you're saying. I don't believe he would be considered to be a hostile witness for the prosecution. But I do think he would definitely be he would be considered an adverse witness for the defense, that they will be allowed to cross-examine him without question. Lynn Harvey, Karen has MS. What happens when you drink alcohol with MS? Would there be a reaction? Lynn is asking me, can it affect driving? I don't know. Interesting question. The testimony, and may I say, not so much the testimony, but what we heard beforehand in briefing, not really so much at trial, was that she had had a whole lot of drinks that night. And there's now been testimony, which we'll get to tomorrow, about her blood alcohol level, which even the next morning was above the legal limit, according to the witnesses for the state. Okay, looking for the Annie. Nope. Same question from Annie K. And Cheatham wants to know, do you think the judge seems biased toward the prosecution? I definitely did think that at first, and I feel like that has changed somewhat, and it may just have been the direction things were going at the time. I do think the judge was very upset by the community. Within the community, there was a lot of controversy over the case, and I think there was a sentiment that some of the witnesses had been badgered by people who believed in this conspiracy against Karen Read. And I think the judge, my impression, believed that was a problem too. Andrea Benson wants to know, why would they want to frame Karen? Always a good question, right? I think the answer would be not so much that they wanted to frame Karen as they wanted to prevent people from being suspicious of Brian Albert or Nicole Albert or Colin Albert or whoever it is who actually killed John O'Keefe. That's what they're trying to argue, is that they wanted to protect their own. And so Karen Read was somebody they could just throw under the bus. They didn't really care about her. She wasn't part of their group. She wasn't a real friend of theirs. She wasn't a family member. So she was an easy target. All right, looking for those question marks at the beginning, and here we go. People in the courtroom are reporting that the jury dozes off for Lally but perks up for the defense. Is this meaningful or just how it goes? Both. Both had charged. I mean, it's horrible if the jury dozes off during any part of your case. That's terrible because they can't possibly decide in your favor if they hear none of your evidence. I mean, how could they? But Lally has a very soft voice. So judges repeatedly said, speak up, talk louder. And it is hard to hear him. So I think that probably has something to do with it. Not so much tuning out as just the softer voice may be harder to follow. However, I can't say whether the jury is sleeping or not because we don't have a visual of them. So I'm just accepting as a generic thing. What if the jury fell asleep during the prosecution case? That would be very bad, but it might not be just because they're rejecting the case. Jadzia is asking me, with all the mishandling of evidence, how has this case not already been dismissed? The jury can decide that that they believe or don't believe that the jury, that the evidence was mishandled. They can believe or not believe the witnesses. So I think the court has just made the choice that these are all arguments. All of this is coming in as evidence and it's going to be allowed in, but the judge is not, but the jury is able to make that final decision. So I think that's how they've sort of handled that. Thunder Snow wants to know, where's the blood? How can there be no blood or tissue on the car or the taillight if it hit him hard enough? And I believe we are going to hear some about the taillight and that there's more to come, in other words. So stay tuned for tomorrow and for further updates in the trial, and we'll talk about that. So Aaron, I appreciate I think I already said that. Thank you though, Aaron. I appreciate it. And Shy Gal, oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad you like listening and that it makes sense. That's really good. This is a complicated case. There have been a lot of witnesses, so I was trying to pack it down as tightly as possible. And I'll do a lot more exhibits for us and stuff to make it a little easier to visualize and see as we keep going. But we got to start somewhere, right? So tonight we get started. And Jersey Jen, thank you. I appreciate it. Marlon, and she is shouting out Marlon and Mama Pinks. They are awesome. They are our moderators here on the channel, and they honestly make the channel go round. I'm so grateful for them. So I will take another question or two, and then don't forget, tune in tomorrow at 7 p.m. We're going to do our part 2, which I hopefully will take us all the way up to date in the case. Christy is asking me, how could they arrest and charge Karen before they've collected and analyzed the evidence, done interviews, etc.? Here's what they would argue, I think, Christy. They would say that they did do all of that, and the defense is going to say not nearly well enough. For example, failing to record that initial interview with Jennifer McCabe is really confusing. How was that even possible? So that sort of thing is what the defense will argue. Maya asking me, were there arguably exigent circumstances for entering the Albert home even without a warrant? I don't think they would have had to. I don't think they even had to think through that. I mean, this was a law enforcement officer. If they simply stated we're going to go get a warrant just to look for it, then I think he would pretty much have had a duty to have abided by that, not changed any evidence inside the home. And if they believed that they had any cause for a warrant, they could have done that. They also could have just asked him, do you mind? Can we look around? Can we search your home? Do you care? And again, being a police officer, he well might say no. It would be within his rights to do that, but he might just feel like, I'm a police officer, I really ought to agree to this. So I don't think they ever needed to enter without a warrant. I think they probably, if they either could have gone and gotten a warrant or attempted to ask him, and it doesn't seem like there was any real effort made to do that. That's the defense point, is they didn't try. And the defense believes there may have been evidence inside the home. Giselle is asking me about the wine glass they found with the body, or the glass that could have come from being in the house, but since there wasn't a search, we'll never know. Did they have a video of him removing a glass from the bar? So I have not heard any testimony about that in this trial, Giselle, but I did think in some of the pre-trial briefing that I read about that I read that they thought or have video of him coming out carrying a glass. So I think that they do think he carried that out of the bar with him. Hedgehog is wondering about all the convenient coincidences in a trial. And indeed, there have been a lot of coincidences. The cross-examination is just really fun. It's been really great. Way more fun than the defense case, probably. Cross-examination is a lot more fun and a lot more interesting. All right, let me head back over here to Nadia and to say thank you. I appreciate that very much. And last question here, I hope I haven't skipped anybody, is from Michelle. Wouldn't the taillight break in large pieces, shards, and not shatter into small pieces? I think it would depend on how it was hit. I don't know the answer to that, but they found at little pieces. There may be testimony from some expert about how a taillight would typically break. I can't answer the question. I don't know how exactly it would be. But that's kind of an interesting question. When you think about hitting it, you do kind of picture that. But I guess since I can't really reconstruct it in my head to figure out how exactly did the taillight break, how did the back of his head, what did he hit it on? If his head was broken in so many places, he clearly hit it on something hard. Was it the car? Was he kneeling down and the car hit him on the back of the head? Did he hit it on the flagpole? I mean, what exactly happened here? I think it's hard to tell. And I don't think we have answers to that yet. So don't forget, tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow.